Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris with Wisconsin FACETS and the 8 webinars in this series. Our presenter for this series is Dr. Sarah Reed. Dr. Reed has a doctoral degree in community psychology and works for Rogers in Health, the education and advocacy department of Rogers Behavioral Health. Dr. Reed also provides staffing support to the Wisconsin Initiative for Stigma Elimination, a statewide coalition of organizations and individuals building resilient and hopeful communities by promoting inclusion and support for all affected by mental health challenges. At Rogers in Health and WISE, she works through partnerships to reduce the stigma associated with mental health challenges, trauma, and substance abuse. So take it away, Dr. Reed.
Yeah, happy to, and happy to be here with you all for this second part of our series, where today we'll be talking about what compassion looks like, rather than what compassion feels like or how it might be indicated in someone else. We really conceive of compassion as being more action-oriented in nature, almost like a verb. And so I want to share with you today, as a part of our self-care snapshot, how you can best see whether you're acting in a way that is compassionate at its core, or if not, where you might be tripping yourself up, or where you could grow in your self-awareness and try again tomorrow and grow in your ability to do so in all aspects of your relationships. Because fundamentally, when we act with compassion, that is across relationships, across the different environments in our lives, whether professional or personal. And so I really hope that you'll find value in what I'm hoping to share with you today that can really be relevant with interactions with anyone and everyone with whom you interact. As a reminder, if you happen to join us for the last webinar, or if you were able to catch it because it was video recorded, you'll recall that this work I'm sharing with you through the series comes from our Compassion Resilience Toolkit. And all of our resources, including the ones that I'm sharing with you during these broadcasts, can be found on our website, compassionresilienceToolkit.org, completely free, completely publicly accessible, and completely flexible, and for you to use as you best see fit. So I would urge you to check it out and see if there are additional tools and resources where you might find value. And today's in particular lesson related to compassion in action, if you go to the website, can be found in our very first chapter of our toolkit. Our first session in our toolkit materials is about what compassion looks like, feels like, sounds like, because ultimately that is the starting point so often in the work that we do and in building intentional relationships that we can really maximize and serve others well. As a reminder, I want to first just level set those of you who are joining me here today on what we even mean when we say compassion resilience. I offer you here two different definitions. The first is a basic definition you might see in a dictionary: the power to return to a place of empathy, strength, and hope after the daily witnessing of the challenges others face in our community and within our homes, and within our professions. That is essentially recognizing that we are at our very nature compassionate people. Especially if you're joining me here today, I know you are a compassionate person because you are interested in this topic and in this webinar. And so I recognize that at our core, we have these abilities to be empathetic, to be resilient, to offer hope to others in the way that we treat them, in the way we communicate with people, and yet also recognize that can be really hard to do amidst all of the challenges that we entertain in our daily lives, amidst challenging interactions with people who are maybe facing trauma or injustices or various complexities, navigating systems that we might be working within. And so it's really recognizing that we have these abilities, that they can become compromised, and then how can we return to them and access them to the best of our abilities. Now, the second definition, it's much simpler, bare bones, and I think pretty compelling. It is about being optimistic in an imperfect world. And I'll be frank, I struggle with this day in and day out, especially amongst the world as we've known it these last 9, 10, 11 months. It's been challenging to keep that optimism and to keep that hope, even as I am the one who is training on these very things. And so anything and everything that I share with you during this half hour or during subsequent webinars is ultimately about having some compassion for ourselves as well, and an element of grace, and to see it as a continuous learning process, how to be compassionate and offer compassion for others, because we all screw up from time to time. We all may fall short on particular days. We have good days and we have bad days. We have days where our optimism is easier to access than others, and we have relationships where it is easier to access than others. I'm going to talk about what that means in just a moment when we walk through our steps to compassionate action and some of the challenges that come in trying to abide by this process. So what I mean when I talk about the steps to compassionate action, this is going to sound pretty rudimentary. At its core, sounds pretty simple, particularly for people who are in healthcare agencies, particularly for people who are trained as school personnel, particularly for people who are in youth serving organizations. If you are doing work with people, this is probably going to sound pretty simplistic. And yet I want to complicate it a bit for us, and hopefully you'll think that helpful. So what do we need to do ultimately to act with compassion in all of our relationships? First, we need to notice that there is a need for it. First, we need to notice people's pain, people's suffering, people's symptoms of mental health challenges, people's crises, people's call for help. We ultimately need to have that perception and have that self-awareness that allows us to connect enough with someone else, despite everything else going on in our lives, and be willing to say, yes, I see you. Yes, what's wrong? What's going on? How could I help? And that's challenging in this virtual environment, I think, all the more, deprived of those abilities to really interact in ways that we as humans have learned to perceive those different signs and signals. And so this, by its very nature, this ability to notice, as of these last 9, 10 months, has been more challenging for the majority of people. If we're able to notice, and that's an if, comes with caveats, we need to turn inward first. Why do we need to do that? This self-check, this element of being mindful, this element of being aware of what's going on inside us is fundamental to us then setting aside what it is that we need to continue to have a conversation with someone that can ultimately be supportive. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll use myself as an example. Sometimes I do a self-check and I think, I can't have this conversation right now because I'm not in a good place. I can't have this conversation with this person right now because we have a fundamental values conflict that takes me out of my ability to be compassionate. Or I can't have this conversation right now because it's hard for me to have a good conversation before I drink my coffee in the morning. So this self-check helps to ensure that we are ultimately caring for ourselves and in a good place. We're putting our mask on first because then it's ultimately easier, more natural, more comfortable to show up for the sake of other people. And now sometimes I'm going to be even more frank here. Sometimes I do this self-check and I think the most compassionate thing I can do is to walk away. The most compassionate thing I can do is to ask somebody else, intercede, and help and support this person. And that's okay. That might be ultimately for the best for both my self-care needs and the other person's. And I'll show you why in a moment. If I'm not caring for myself in this self-check mode, then I won't do the rest of these steps. to the best of my ability. I won't be as compassionate as I might otherwise be. Case in point, this next step, seeking to understand, this is getting curious, this is asking questions, this is finding out more about context, learning about the other person's feelings, capabilities, and strengths. And if I'm not in a compassionate place, if I'm not in a healthy place myself, if my self-check suggested perhaps I ought not have this conversation, my ability to understand and to question is fundamentally compromised, because I will bring to that conversation my biases, my own pain, and place on somebody else my own needs at the expense of really attending to theirs. If I'm able to get curious, if I'm able to seek to understand in this third stage here, I ultimately want to learn what is helpful so that I can cultivate a sense of empathy. And empathy is not connecting immediately to the experiences or to the identity that another person has. It's about what's underneath. What are the feelings that are being shared? Because I bet we can all empathize with those feelings being shared. In fact, research shows there are about 12 fundamental universal feelings: happiness, grief, disgust, anger, joy, and so on and so forth. If we can connect to those underlying feelings, empathize with those underlying feelings, our ability to see the common humanity in other people, and then to proceed through the rest of these steps, increases exponentially. So I need not be a peer, per se, to garner that sense of empathy. Instead, I need to return to that element of self-check so that I can connect on that basic level of feelings or of somebody's strengths. So even though that these steps are indicated as a cycle of sorts and linear in nature, really that second step, that ability to self-check, is woven throughout. As I cultivate empathy, because I'm doing my due diligence with that self-check, I then want to proceed with finding out how to best help someone access their own strengths, their own solutions, their own wisdom. Because people ultimately have that. More often than not, we are the holders of our own wisdom and our own solutions. And yet oftentimes, when people are really busy and overwhelm themselves, or their self-check may have indicated that they have other things they ought to attend to, our tendency as compassionate, well-intentioned human beings during this fifth step is fundamentally the opposite of that which it ought to be. Many of us, despite our training, despite our level of compassion, despite our best intentions, go into fix-it mode. We offer solutions. We tell people our own perspective. We want to offer up what's worked for us in the past. Or if I'm guessing a number of you work with young people, we see young people hurting and struggling, and we just want to make it better. And we think perhaps the best, easiest path to making it better is to either do the work for them or to find a solution that we think would be a quick fix. And I'll be honest here, with this step number 5, it is the most challenging of all of these steps for people to do consistently, to avoid that tendency to go into fix-it mode, and instead to continue helping people learn their own strengths and listen to them in their own wisdom. Now, if you're someone who's familiar with motivational interviewing, that will be part and parcel to your skill set and to your aptitudes. And if you are not someone familiar with motivational interviewing, it might be a concept that could help with this process and this step number 5 in particular. So if we are able then to listen and help someone discern their best next steps, we ultimately need to follow through. We need to take action. That is the only way that we show that we have heard what someone says, that we have heard their needs, that we are then taking ownership and accountability in a compassionate way to help close the loop on this process. Now, this is fundamentally important in a lot of our work and a lot of our communication and interactions with young people, with people who've experienced trauma, and with people who have mental health histories. And that is because there is already a tendency not to trust, or it is important in those relationships to build and maintain that trust. And so if we fall short on this 6th step and don't follow through and don't meet our commitments, that is doing a fundamental harm, a fundamental injustice to that person's pain. So I just complicated these steps. I'm going to try to break it down a little bit further. And I'm ultimately going to say that despite all of these challenges that I've just articulated, I believe you all can do this. It takes some mindfulness, it takes some practice, it takes some element of grace for ourselves. And it can be helpful to practice. So during our compassion resilience trainings and participant groups, that's what we fundamentally offer people an opportunity to do, is to look at different situations in which they might need to have a compassionate conversation, and then to try to navigate through why that might be challenging, where the sticking points may be, and what they could do differently if the situation were with somebody who's a little bit different. Because let's face it, we all have particular people or relationships in our lives where the ability to act compassionately, like I just showed on the previous slide, is more challenging. Now, here's one scenario that we typically have people walk through, and I'll read it aloud. A colleague shares with you that one of her 8-year-old students has been on her mind. His family struggles, and he has a lot of potential. He's shut down and acting out with tears and tantrums. Recently, he hit her, and she didn't tell the principal to avoid consequences for him. She loses sleep and wakes up with this student on her mind. She tells you that she may be the only one who can get through to him. She's considering an outing with him on a Saturday to give his family a break. She cares, but she is definitely stressed. Now, if you tuned in to the previous webinar, or you're familiar at all with the cycle of fatigue, you will see that in this scenario, this person, this colleague of yours, is facing an abundance of compassion fatigue, is starting to feel the symptoms that tend to be associated with it. Feeling alienated, feeling persecuted, feeling stressed, manifesting anxiety in her life, taking her work home with her. And so she is, I'm sure, a compassionate person by nature who's doing something that she probably ought not to do, is overstepping some boundaries, is going above and beyond in ways that aren't really at the heart of those compassionate action steps. Which were, let's return to those and think through it now that we've had an example in which to process them. If you were that person's colleague, if you wanted to help that coworker, you would first have to notice that she's going outside her lane. You'd first have to notice her anxiety. You would first have to notice that she is consumed by thoughts of helping this young person in ways that will actually probably do the opposite. You'll have to notice that she is experiencing fatigue or exhaustion or burnout or anxiety, or however you want to label it. Can you do that? In what situations are you most apt to notice? You then have to self-check. What comes to mind thinking about interacting with a colleague like that? It may arouse some complicated questions for you. If you are that person's supervisor, you are not going to like the situation. You are going to think, wow, boundaries issues, or wow, liability issues. If you are that person's friend, you're going to be really, really concerned for her well-being. If you are that person, the parent of that young child, you will have an entirely different self-check. But each of us will have some feelings and emotions that prop up that it is helpful to first attend to before seeking to understand. If we want to seek to understand with that particular colleague, we might say, hey, what's going on? I notice this is preoccupying you. Tell me a little more. You might say, I'm concerned about you. What's going on? I might say, I'm seeing maybe a little anxiety. What are you doing to attend to that? You're getting curious. You're noticing them. And simply by noticing other people is fundamentally validating and compassionate in practice. So you're getting curious. I bet that you can relate in some way, shape, or form to what she shares with you are her core feelings. I can certainly relate to the anxiety. I can certainly relate to that feeling of connectedness between one particular person or client or patient that I've been serving. I can certainly connect to wanting to help. And so that ability to empathize with what you learn, so foundational to being to approach one another with grace, common humanity, and a solution-focused mindset. Solution-focused that is ultimately in the purview of the other person rather than what we think they ought to do. And so in discerning best action, how might you approach this with your coworker or your colleague? You might say things like, I think that this has happened in the past with another student. What worked for you then? You might say, I see that you really care. What can we do to help care for you while you're caring for others? You might say, what is it that I could do to support you? And if you really have advice or recommendation or a great, brilliant, big idea you want to share with this person, I'm really guilty of that. I will tell you, I have some great ideas and I just want to tell people, right? You might say, I have an idea. Would you like to hear my perspective? You ask for consent to share that idea. 9 times out of 10, people just want someone to listen to us. 9 times out of 10, by listening and talking and weeding through it, we will access our own solutions. That is the element of growth mindset. And then you follow up. Whatever it is that is asked of you to help support this coworker or colleague, you then do. And that is closing the loop in this instance of acting with compassion. Now, I told you that we're all a little flawed when it comes to this. I'm gonna just own that. I want to ask you just to close us out here, a couple self-reflective questions that you could ask yourself that could help you on this journey. What are the situations or the challenges that you have noticing? I'll tell you what mine are. I get easily distracted. I have a dozen and one things on my mind. If there's a lot of noise, I can't give things my full attention. If I haven't had my coffee in the morning, I can't give things my full attention. If I'm not taking care of my own mental health, my ability to see others' pain goes by the wayside. What is it for you? What is challenging about that element of the self-check? Claiming our own implicit biases is probably the first and foremost challenge with that self-check. Being mindful might be another one. So what are some strategies or tools or ways that we might more consistently engage in that self-check? In what relationships, with who, is that ability to empathize most challenging? It might be somebody who is the exact opposite of you, who riles your nerves, who makes you feel fatigued, with whom you have a fundamental value conflict of some kind. And for others of you, it might be the person most like yourself, because they arouse in us these tendencies to question ourselves. So who is it? What relationships prove the most challenging? Number 4, how can you stave off fix-it mode? It is our natural tendency. I gave you a couple questions and prompts that could work. I have this go-to list of things that I say to keep myself out of that fix-it mentality. And if you check out our Compassion Resilience Toolkit again, in section 1, there's actually a really fantastic resource that offers a list of different questions and prompts and ways in which to do just this. And then lastly, when is follow through a challenge? What might you do to better close that loop? So these are essentially a couple questions that I hope you spend some time processing so that we're more apt to act as consistently as possible from that foundation of compassion. I want to close us off with this break for our hearts, as I'm calling it, or maybe a mindful closing. This is helping us to recognize our common humanity. And for me, it really helps my ability to do that empathizing aspect. And so if you're watching me, take your eyes off the screen, look down at the floor, shut your eyes for just a moment. And I want you to picture the person in your life who is the most challenging in one of those areas, the person in your life who fundamentally makes you feel fatigued or that you are frustrated with. And as you're picturing them, bring them as close to mind as you possibly can, and listen to what I'm going to say. Just like me, this person is seeking happiness in their life. Just like me, this person is trying to avoid suffering in their life. Just like me, this person has known sadness, loneliness, and despair. Just like me, this person is seeking to fill their needs. Just like me, this person is learning about life. And if you want to bring your attention back to the screen, just like me, you all, we all are learning about life. And so again, I want to remind us, if anything I've shared has been upsetting or unnerving or made you think critically of yourself or judgmentally of yourself because maybe you've fallen short in one instance or in one relationship or in one of those steps, remind yourself you are learning too. Thank you so very much for tuning in to our second webinar. I am going to close the loop now and hand the reins back off to Chris so that she can close out our time together.
Thank you so much to Sarah Reed for presenting to us today on this valuable topic. I know the break for our heart really meant something to me. I really, really appreciate that. I want to remind everyone that this is a series of webinars that will run monthly through August, and you can register for them on the Wisconsin FACETS website. And actually, I hope you all did download the handout for today so that you can have these questions and this break for your heart to refer back to. Thanks to all for attending the training. The recording and a survey will be sent to you shortly. We would greatly appreciate your completion of the survey. That is it for today. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Take care.